Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you're all fueled up, had your cup of tea or coffee, stretch your legs, and are ready for Plenary 1. My name is Yolande Agimo. I'll get straight to it by introducing our moderator for this session on global security demands a global response. I'd like to invite Giannina Segnini, Director of the Master of Science Data Journalism at my alma mater, Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this first plenary session. Global security demands a global response. I'm very pleased to be here with an exceptional panel of experts. And if you read the description for this plenary, it starts saying that governments from around the world are falling short on their commitments against corruption. I think we fell short with that statement. Just this week, as we speak, countries like Mongolia, South Africa, Sudan are struggling with corruption cases and scandals that are causing chaos, and not in those countries only, but around the world. And yes, corruption also triggers unrest, repression, and violence. With the help of our panelists, this first plenary will explore the reasons why regional and global platforms or standards are not effectively stopping illicit financial flows and kleptocratic waves that, of course, are putting global security at risk. So our panelists will share what they're doing at the individual level and institutional level to address these issues and to successfully implement effective measures against corruption. So let me introduce you our panelists. We have Claudia Escobar, former magistrate of the Court of Appeals in Guatemala. Welcome, Claudia. We have Bjørn Sandkjær, State Secretary for Development in Norway. Thank you for joining us. And we have Mohamedou Diagne, VP for Integrity at the World Bank. And Mrs. Paula Santos da Costa, Director of the Office of Integrity and Anti-Corruption for the Africa Development Bank. And last but not least, Raja Kumar, President of the Financial Action Task Force. So I'm going to give them 7 minutes, each of them, to address the public, and then we're going to engage in a conversation. And at the end, we're going to have a Q&A, so get ready for your questions. At the end, you can come and use one of the mics in the room. But let's going to start with Raja.
Well, thank you for the floor. I'm really delighted to be here. I've traveled 8,000 plus miles to attend this important event, and I think that's a sign of the importance that I assign to this very important meeting. Let me just say that it's encouraging to both see and hear from so many experts who are gathered here today, all of us united by a common goal to tackle corruption. You've heard already from the past speakers that possibly $2 trillion US are generated by criminal activities each year. And if you look at the scale of estimated proceeds of crime from corruption, that's another $1 trillion. So this is no small change. And what we are seeing has real human and societal costs. Look at what happened over the past few years as the world battled COVID-19. Criminals and corrupt officials swindled funds, crucial medical supplies were subject to fraud, and government contracts were misused for personal gain. The corrupt profited at the expense and safety of the general public. This endangered lives, damaged communities, and fueled distrust in authorities. Money was flowing out of economies at precisely the time that health and public services needed it most. These are all very compelling reasons why stopping corruption is so important. Corruption hurts people, it hurts societies, and it hurts deep. One of the effective ways to stop corruption is to combat money laundering. When countries have ineffective measures to protect against money laundering, it enables corruption. The FATF, the global watchdog against money laundering and terrorism financing, leads a global action to tackle money laundering and terrorism financing. A strong anti-money laundering framework actually helps to deter serious crimes, including corruption. More than 200 countries and jurisdictions have committed to implementing the FATF standards, with many of them making progress. But the hard truth is that most countries are not doing enough. While we are seeing that countries are putting in place legislation, this is not sufficient. What is really needed is effective implementation of the legislation to then drive concrete results, tangible outcomes, and we are not seeing enough of that at this point in time. Right now, too many criminals and the corrupt are free to enjoy the profits of their crime. So, this is why the FATF is working on a number of areas to close regulatory loopholes to prevent the corrupt from getting away with their illicit funds. Let me first touch on the issue of beneficial ownership and its transparency. The FATF has long warned about how anonymous shell companies and trusts have been abused for illicit purposes. We have developed, in fact, global standards to prevent this abuse. Yet every revelation, such as the Panama and Pandora Papers, is a stark reminder that the system is not working well enough. We need to do better. The FATF undertook an extensive review to revise its standards on transparency of beneficial ownership. In March this year, our members adopted revisions to the FATF standards to stop criminals from laundering dirty money and hiding illicit activities to complex corporate structures or legal persons. This is a major step forward in eliminating corporate secrecy. We are also continuing to take steps to strengthen transparency requirements for legal arrangements such as trusts, and launch a public consultation on our proposals in October, which just ended yesterday. The weakness in implementation means that the corrupt and organized crime groups will continue getting away with laundering funds by exploiting the different types of assets using unregulated entities and anonymous transactions. The second area I wanted to focus on, apart from beneficial ownership transparency, is the importance of asset recovery. In addition to having robust preventative measures, we also need to strengthen our asset recovery frameworks. Money, at the end of the day, is the motivator and driver of most serious crime, including corruption. The sad reality is that globally we are confiscating less than 1% of the proceeds of crime, which means that the criminals and the corrupt are getting away with their dirty money. FATF's country assessments also show that many of the countries are not effectively recovering assets. Many countries do not even prioritize it. And so this is a major problem that we collectively need to address. FATF is now joining forces with partners such as Interpol to improve global collaboration that will make a real difference, I believe, on the ground. Let me now focus on the third part of my presentation, which was really FATF's enhanced focus to target corruption and money laundering. In April this year, the FATF ministers committed to strengthen our focus on corruption by committing to close gaps and making better use of anti-money laundering tools. This includes, firstly, starting work on how citizenship and residency investment schemes can be misused. Secondly, by developing guidance for assessors on how to assess implementation of the UNCAC. And thirdly, by reviewing how the non-financial sector, such as trust and company service providers, real estate agents, and lawyers, how they facilitate corruption. In conclusion, there's clearly a lot that needs to be done. I recognize the constraints that governments have in terms of budget, but frankly, governments need to invest more in law enforcement to essentially build both capability and capacity to ensure that they can conduct investigations that are often complex and increasingly across borders. Authorities need to know who owns and who controls anonymous shell companies to tackle money laundering from corruption. They also need to be able to exchange information and cooperate both quickly and effectively with their counterparts. But this is not just limited to governments that need to take action. The private sector, banks, and the non-financial sector businesses and professions all need to play their part too. They should put in place robust anti-money laundering controls, expeditiously file suspicious transaction reports, and continue to work very closely with the authorities. FATF, on our part, remains committed to safeguarding financial integrity and helping make the world safer. But we need countries to step up and do their part. We need them to implement the FATF standards both fully and effectively. Small loopholes in significant financial centers can cause serious problems in the global financial system. By tackling money laundering, governments are tackling corruption. Working together, all of us in different roles that we're all playing here, private sector, NGOs, and governments, we can make, I believe, a significant impact in this fight against corruption. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Raja. I'm pretty sure that we're going to have so many questions about your remarks. Paula, thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the U.S. government to organize and receive us here, and also to the International Anti-Corruption Conference. And thank you very much for those who are in the room, still in the room, to be here to assist to this conversation. And thank you for the invitation, for inviting the African Development Bank. I would like to start by a little bit presentation about our bank, our institution. So the African Development Bank is a financial public institution. Our mission is to finance development and prosperity in terms of economic and social prosperity of the African continent. We are very committed against corruption. We have a strategy in terms of good governance, and we work with our regional member countries. Our regional member countries, in fact, are the 54 African countries, but we do have also as shareholders non-African countries, 27. So the countries are the shareholders of our institution. We are a AAA institution, and we support the regional member countries in financing projects in terms of the priority areas that have been decided as priority in Africa, for Africa, which are energy, industrializing, integrating Africa, improving the quality of life of Africans. So in financing these projects, we do take into consideration, and we have a legal framework, an anti-corruption framework, which includes also not only the FATF recommendations, because we have an illicit financial flows policy, which includes most of the recommendations that FATF has in terms of AML, CFT. And we are an observer of the FATF, the African Development Bank. We promote the inclusive and durable development of the African continent. Anti-corruption framework includes a prevention and a curative side. On the prevention, we work very closely, not only with the regional member countries, but also with the partners in terms of, for example, the anti-corruption agencies with project implementation units in the countries in order to promote integrity. I think that earlier on we heard about ethical values. I do believe, on my personal experience, that we can change things through education. Integrity is about values, is about a behavior. At the African Development Bank, we decided that we will apply a zero tolerance for any acts of corruption. Of course, things are not perfect. This is a permanent and an ongoing effort. We do work with the regional member countries to promote transparency in procurement, good governance in the operations also. We do promote integrity through training also, capacity building, and reinforcing the technical capacity of those that are on the ground fighting every day against these acts of corruption that are really an obstacle for our mission, because the aim is to reduce poverty, is to promote development, and clearly acts of corruption are a clear obstacle to our mission. And for that reason, our commitment is central in preventing and fighting corruption at the African Development Bank. And when, in terms of identifying allegations, we do have a whistleblower policy and line which allows every citizen to report on acts of fraud or corruption in the regional member countries. Our department, the Department of the Integrity and Anti-Corruption at the African Development Bank, is the department responsible for handling the complaints. We have the capacity to investigate. We do investigate, and when we find that there is a fraud or corruption, it is possible to have a sanction, and this sanction is a cross-the-board sanction, meaning that the other multilateral development banks will also apply this sanction to this entity or individual, because we have a common framework. I think that later on the conversation we will be able to talk about what next steps, because I think it is important to say that it is true that we have sufficient framework, I believe, conventions, international conventions, organizations, but I do believe that in terms of implementation, perhaps we need to do a better effort and be more practical with timelines and goals to be attained in a very short period of time, meaning that we need immediate measures. Long-term measures, in my personal experience, would be education, training, capacity building, technical assistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula. We're going to discuss certainly the important points you're making in your remarks. Muhammadu Diagne, what's your point of view from the World Bank on what can be done to successfully implement measures against corruption?
Great, thank you very much. And again, adding my voice to the other panelists, we are really grateful to have this opportunity to interact with you in this conference. So we really thank the organizers, TI, the State Department, and all the parties that were involved. The great news about, I think, coming after my good colleague Paula is that she's done pretty much all of the job in terms of discussing the mandate and the mission of the organization, because quite frankly, it's the same thing for the World Bank, except that we are doing it at the global stage rather than just at the regional or the continental stage. But I think everything Paula indicated about the developmental mandate and mission absolutely applies to the World Bank. In terms of corruption, and I think David, our president, alluded to it a little earlier when he referred to the famous cancer of corruption speech of President Wolfenson back in '96. There has been a gradual, maybe a slow, a gradual, but nonetheless a real evolution in how the World Bank, and I believe all IFIs, international financial institutions, look at the issue of corruption. I think for a long time, certainly up to the beginning of the 80s, to the mid-80s, it was seen pretty much as a political issue, something that they would not touch on because it was not seen as the mandate of IFIs. I think there has been a complete shift in both mindset and approaches as far as corruption is concerned. We do realize that it is not just a political issue, it is actually a developmental issue. I will not come back to the economic costs. I think we've heard a lot of figures since this morning, so I don't need to go back and reiterate the economic costs of corruption. The market distortions that it's creating, which make it extremely difficult to level the playing field for the private sector and to attract private investment, without which countries cannot develop. These inequalities and the poverty is driving. And increasingly, it is being seen as well as a key driver of fragility, conflict, and violence in countries. We are recognizing corruption as a major driver of it, and we've had some very recent examples that I don't need to go through. And that last element is quite important because these environments, the so-called FCVs, environment afflicted by conflict and violence, are a priority for the bank. That's a big part of our developmental mission. And when you look at fragility, conflict, and violence, a big chunk of the driver has to do with corruption. Because think about those environments, the issues have to do generally with lack of access to justice, to rule of law, to opportunities, and also to security. And all of these things are impeded to a large degree by corruption in those countries. So you cannot address fragility, conflict, and violence without tackling the issue of corruption in those countries. And based on the World Bank's data, by 2030, well over half of the world population will be living in those FCV environments. And if corruption is a major driver of fragility, and that's where half of the world's extreme poor will be living, that's something we have to address. So for all these reasons, there has been a shift in our approach and really an increasing focus on issues of corruption. How do we address it? I would say it's at 3 different levels. The first level is at the project level, the projects that we are funding. We are putting in place a lot of both upstream safeguards and downstream mechanisms. The upstream safeguards, we are setting very clear standards in terms of the procurement in our projects, in terms of the financial management, and it is not just about setting standards, it's actually verifying by doing procurement review, by auditing the projects from a financial perspective to make sure those standards are adhered to. We are doing a lot in terms of detection. The Integrity Vice Presidency, which is my unit, is actually responsible for reviewing all allegations of fraud and corruption in the bank's project. Just to give you a sense, just this past fiscal year that we finished, we reviewed over 3,000 allegations. Now, even if you rule out the frivolous allegations and the ones that do not fall within our mandate, that's still a pretty significant amount that we review, and we absolutely pursue the credible ones and investigate them. And the third element is the sanctions. Once we do the fact-finding and find that there has been corruption, we have a very robust sanction system. Just to give you a sense, since our current sanction system has been in place since 2007, we have sanctioned about 800 entities, and the most common sanction is debarment. But that gives you about a sense, and I think Laura talked about the cross-debarment that we have with other MDBs. That's at the project level. The second layer of our intervention is at the country level, because we do realize that corruption happens in an ecosystem. We cannot just work on the project, we also have to work on that ecosystem. So at that level, really we're doing a number of things. Number one, governance and corruption issues are now fully embedded in the strategic priorities of the World Bank Group. Just to give you an example, about a year ago, we went through the replenishment of IDA, the International Development Association. This was a pretty significant replenishment, $93 billion. And we made a number of commitments. And one of those commitments was actually to help either countries fight issues of fraud, corruption, tax evasion, and the like. And we are actually working with those countries. So it's absolutely embedded in our strategy of working with either countries. The second strategy framework I would mention is the FCV strategy, Fragile, Conflict, and Violent Countries. We have developed a whole strategy that revolves around 6 themes. I will not go through the 6 themes, but one of them is rule of law and justice, which addresses all these issues of fraud and corruption. Again, that's another area where fraud and corruption is directly embedded in our strategic priorities. And as we speak, again, from a strategic standpoint, the World Bank is working on what we call an anti-corruption action paper, which will actually outline our priorities going forward in the areas of fraud and corruption, and it will address issues, many of the issues we talked about, like beneficial ownership transparency, the issue of building solid accountability institutions and rule of law, helping countries with procurement, transparency, and the like. So all those will be outlined in the anti-corruption action paper. So all to say that we have really a comprehensive framework at the country level. And the second aspect is the capacity building, really helping countries build very strong institutions. I think it's been said over and over again, we have a lot of rules, we have a lot of frameworks, we have a lot of norms, and it's okay to think about how we improve them because we can always do better. But that's not where the gap is. The gap is in implementation. We can have more rules on the book, we can have more frameworks, we can have more guidance, but they are only as good as their implementation. And a good part of implementation is having very solid institutions that can actually drive accountability, which is why the World Bank is really focusing on that aspect. As we speak, for example, we are working with over 70 different countries to help with their state supreme audit institutions. We are helping with anti-corruption agencies, and we are helping with a number of other institutions. So we think that whole area of institutions is an extremely important area. And the last one is at the global level. I talked at the project level, at the country level, and at the global level. Partnership is a big element of our approach. I think Laura mentioned the work we are doing with our colleagues who are in the other MDBs. As a matter of fact, this week, on the margins of the IACC, the heads of integrity units of the MDBs have been meeting since yesterday. We work a lot hand in hand to harmonize our approaches. We have the cross-department agreement, which gives a lot of teeth to our sanctions, because once you get sanctioned by one, you get sanctioned by the others. We have so far sanctioned more than 1,000 companies and entities. STAR is another initiative of partnership in accordance. I think our President David mentioned it. We work with UNODC for the repatriation of assets that were stolen, the return of stolen assets. That's another initiative. We are involved in the Global Network that Ms. Gadawali talked about earlier. So I think all those approaches are to develop partnership with our different institutions. So that's really, I think I will stop there, but this is the approach of the World Bank at the project, at the country, and at the global level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Muhammadu. Pior.
Thank you. And let me also join my voice to the previous speakers in thanking the organizers in bringing us together to talk about this incredibly important topic. Now, the case for why this is important has been made very well earlier today, so I'm not going to repeat it. But it is interesting to listen to the previous panelists and see how we all play different roles in trying to address corruption, illicit financial flows, and all the other questions that we are talking about. And I don't think we disagree on the description of the problem. But how then do we respond to the global problem of corruption and its effects on global security, which is what we've been asked to talk about today? So there are, in this landscape that is complex, there are a number of entry points. I thought that I would, from Norway's experience, and we have been involved for a long time in trying to address corruption, I thought I would talk about what we call grand corruption, which is an evolving issue coming up also on the global political agenda, where, and I would like to compliment our colleagues in the media for providing us with the massive leaks of documents. that have opened the door to a world of grand corruption. That world is populated by public and private leaders engaged in financial crimes for the benefit of the few at the cost of the citizens they are in high positions to serve. And the leaks have revealed a complicit global ecosystem of complex company structures and hidden beneficiaries, a world where large amounts of illicitly acquired assets are transferred by service providers across borders, hidden in secrecy jurisdictions, laundered and transformed into real estates, jets, yachts, jewelry, and art. Effective investigation, prosecution, adjudication, and sanctions are necessary, and we've heard that from panelists as well, but unfortunately, these are also demanding and infrequent, and so impunity is a considerable challenge when we discuss how we deal with grand corruption. We have made great progress thanks to a lot of the people who are here in this room. One instrument that that is very important is the UNCAC, which I think next year is celebrating its 20th anniversary. It has close to universal adherence. Much has been done in many countries to put legal instruments, anti-corruption strategies and bodies in place. A lot is still undone, and I think Mohamedou made the case, a very compelling case, that it's not enough to have the policies there, we have to implement them. So I believe it's useful to identify some of the most serious challenges. We've had some discussions from the Norwegian perspective with our partners, and we have identified 7, so I'm going to list them. The first is beneficial ownership secrecy, which several others have mentioned as well, where we may need a global standard for beneficial ownership transparency. We need to disincentivize financial, legal, accounting, and other intermediaries from functioning as service providers and enablers of corruption. Number 3 is that we should no longer accept the existence of safe havens. 4 has also been mentioned earlier, where assets have been recovered and returned at insufficient scale and speed. So perhaps we also need to talk about a consolidated framework for asset recovery and return. And Norway is also involved in the STAR initiative that was mentioned by UNODC and the World Bank initiative for asset recovery, which is, I think, very important. The 5th is the risk of corruption in public procurement, which we know is very high. As we now are in a global situation where I feel we are met with crisis upon crisis, the urgency and the large amounts of assistance that this generates, which is fantastic, because as a global community, we need to respond to these crises. Unfortunately, that is also a particularly corruption-prone context. So we need to, that's a challenge, how to most effectively mitigate that risk. 6, how can we explore international measures to help break the vicious cycle of grand corruption and impunity? And finally, to jointly ensure more inclusive processes to counteract the current trend of civil space for civil society. So those were my 7 challenges. Do I have time for 4 questions that we may ask ourselves as well?
Absolutely.
So in moving forward and sort of moving the discussion to what can we do? One important question for us that we ask ourselves is how to speed up effective implementation of the existing anti-corruption commitments. What operative measures, guidelines, and tools could be helpful? We also think it would be important to talk about how we can improve mutual legal assistance. The 3rd idea is how far we can get with upscaling technical assistance and improved review mechanisms. And finally, to ask ourselves if we have the necessary and sufficient globally agreed rules of the game. What could be, for example, the potential positive effect of consolidating various sets of standards to clarify and simplify our common approach? We need to be candid in our discussions because corruption is certainly not restricted to certain parts of the world. Grand corruption involves countries of origin, transfer, and destination, and I think we all have a shared responsibility to get on that fast track to uproot corruption and other financial crimes. So we believe, just to end, that our solutions need to be based on the fundamental values of transparency, accountability, and integrity. And again, Norway has been involved in this area, these discussions, and I would even say this fight for a long time. And we certainly remain ready to participate in these constructive processes to explore ways and means to effectively address the multifaceted challenges of transnational grant corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Björk. Finally, we're going to have Claudia Escobar, former magistrate in Guatemala who has investigated many of these corruption cases and has a global view of what's going on in the judiciary. Welcome, Claudia.
Okay, thank you very much for being here, and thank you to Transparency International for inviting me to join this panel. I want to put a highlight in the importance of the independence of the judiciary, but also I would like to spotlight judicial corruption, and that's what I will take my remarks on it. And I think it's important to defend the rule of law, to defend separation of powers. I know it's something that maybe we take for granted, but as a judge for 10 years in Guatemala, I can tell you it's not that easy. It's not easy to be a judge in a country where corruption is systemic. Guatemala went through a long period of civil war in the last century, and there are moments of windows of opportunity when you can build institutions, when you have the support of the international community and the political power maybe to change the institutions. But I think that that's not enough when organized crime is really taking your country as a hostage. And when we talk about judicial corruption, we have to understand how complex is the judicial system. It's not only about the higher courts. Judicial corruption is entrenched in all the levels of the judiciary. And I've seen, clerks, how clerks extort the citizens in petite corruption. I also saw cases of grand corruption. Meanwhile, I was a judge until the moment I had to expose the head of the Congress for trying to bribe me in a case that will favor the vice president if I accepted. And that was the case that forced me to leave my country. But I will also say that I was not prepared to face the level of corruption that I saw in the judiciary during that time. And even though, my principles were very strict and I tried to fight corruption all the time, I also put my life at risk many times. I received death threats every time I tackled corruption. And being a judge in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua is not the same that being a judge in Norway, in Canada, here in the United States. So we have to consider, what is happening to the countries that are most corrupt. Transparency International has the index of, the perception of corruption. And if we look at that, we can see that there is a link between the most corrupt countries and the level of the judiciary, the credibility that these institutions have. And that's why I think that we really need to focus on what is happening when corruption gets to the judiciary. Corruption is like a cancer, and there's different types of cancers and different types to address corruption. But when you are talking about judicial corruption, you're talking about impunity. And some countries, like my country, has 98% level of impunity. That means this is the paradise for all criminal activities. And these are countries that are being, like Guatemala and other countries, are being taken really by organized crime. And some institutions that are extremely weak are not able to face organized crime. They are extremely powerful, they are connected, they have a lot of resources. And I think that in the international level, we don't have really a tool to face organized crime when they take control of an institution. So I think that taking control of the judicial system is also the first step for autocratic governments. We see Venezuela, we see Nicaragua. It is the first step. But also, when you undermine the judiciary, you can also end up with anarchy, as it happened in Haiti. We saw recently what happened in Afghanistan. where many of the judges had to flee. So the effect for human security is incredible, because judges are really the human rights defenders by nature. If we don't protect them, if we don't guarantee their security, then everybody is at risk. So the whole world is at risk when we have regions that are run by kleptocrats. So I think it's important that citizens understand why they need to protect the judiciary, also that the media put attention when judges are persecuted. In my country, as I told you, there was a window of opportunity 10 years ago to strengthen the rule of law. We also had a very interesting international effort with the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala that many of you know at CICIG. CICIG worked in the country for 12 years. It helped to empower the judges, it helped to empower the prosecutors. There were many cases of corruption that were investigated, but when you fight corruption, corruption fights back. So different groups that are used to impunity didn't like the work of CICIG, and they forced this mission to get out of the country. But after that, they start persecuting everybody that had a key role in the fight against corruption. And right now, there are many judges and prosecutors in exile in the United States, in Europe, in Central America. They cannot go back to the country, and the ones who remain in the country, some of them are in jail, and some others are, facing a lot of retaliation. They cannot get a job in the country because they work for an anti-corruption commission. So, under these circumstances, we really need to be creative and to think about what can we do, how can we really imagine another way of fighting corruption. And there are different initiatives. I think one very interesting initiative is the creation of an international anti-corruption court that is being promoted by the Integrity Initiatives International. It's going to be a panel during this week that you are invited to go and to learn more about it. But also we need to think about regional organizations. What is the difference between Europe and Latin America? Why the countries in Europe, are more successful in fighting corruption? And I think that it has to do also with institutions, with regional institutions that help the countries to strengthen their own institutions. And I just want to end my remark thinking about the words of Martin Luther King that said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Thank you very much, Claudia. We have enough material to continue talking for the rest of the week, but let's get straight to the point. We've been hearing since early in the morning about, there's one word ringing, which is implementation. And so I'm going to start engaging in a conversation with Raja. Raja, you mentioned that, and of course we all celebrate all the important changes over the years, especially when it comes to beneficial ownership, and you mentioned that during your remarks. But what do we do if countries are not willing to really implement these measures? We have talked about platforms, policies, regulation, and of course there's the area of technical compliance. But what can we do to, I don't know, I don't know what word to use, invite, or actually more than that, do we need to elevate these voluntary guidelines and standards into something that is legally binding? Do we need, new rules? Is this on the table, this discussion about how to enforce successfully these measures?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a pretty fundamental one. I mentioned earlier that, since FEDEF was set up in 1989, what has really changed is with the focus on money laundering. Practically every country now has a money laundering offense that's been enacted. And that wasn't the case 30 years ago. So we have seen progress in terms of legislation being put in place. But now the more fundamental question is, with the legislation in place, what results are you demonstrating? Are you taking effective action against perpetrators? What kind of sanctions are they receiving? Are they just getting a slap on the wrist and then, they basically, feel that, the system is very lax, and so you continue with, your crime and corruption? So it has to be dissuasive sanctions. It has to have bite. It has to have the deterrent effect. And so this is the part, I think, that countries need to very consciously prioritize and commit to funding, both in terms of developing capabilities that are needed and capacity. So let me give you an example of what I see as new capabilities. We know that criminals, terrorists, the corrupt, are using crypto assets. And so the question is, are law enforcement agencies in each of your countries equipped to deal with this challenge? Are they up to speed on new technologies? Because as we've heard, right, from the different speakers today, the sad fact is, with the huge amounts of money that criminals and the corrupt are getting away with, they are able to buy the latest technologies. They're able to subvert systems, and that's why we talk about it as being a cancer. They're able to influence countries from outside because they have significant resources. And so I think it's really a high-order challenge and a priority that we need to go after the proceeds of crime. We need to take away assets from the corrupt so that you defund them. You basically cut off the lifeblood of criminal and corrupt enterprise, which is money.
I totally agree with you, and as I hear you talking, I wonder, what specific measures, I know you don't like to talk about specific countries, none of you, but I'm a journalist, so I'm allowed. And over the last 30 years, I've seen, as a member of the ICIJ, leak after leak, how, the epicenter of action moves from one place to another. Is like, and forgive me the example, but it's like fumigating cockroaches from one room and they go to the next room. So if countries don't have the will, think about those countries that are already taken by, as Claudia was saying, by organized crime, hijacked totally by corruption, and by leaders who have no interest in engaging in this kind of global conversation. So what do we do with those specific cases? Okay,
so let me follow up then with the second part of my answer, which is really that, let's talk about FATF and, we are called the global watchdog in relation to anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism. But this watchdog has teeth. It's not a toothless watchdog. The teeth comes from mutual evaluations that fellow members of FATF and the global network, we audit each other, and the results are then publicly released for the world to see. And FATF has called out countries that are deficient in their systems, and we have a gray list and a black list. And so you are actually called out. And that's really, I think if you think about it from a reputational risk perspective, not just from a reputational risk perspective, it actually has an impact on the economy. A country that is on the blacklist, for example, the FATF blacklist, it means that banks that are dealing with that country and transactions from that country have to adopt enhanced due diligence, which means asking a lot more questions. The velocity of transactions then comes down, which means a slowdown, right, in the speed of trade, for example. So there's real bite, and I think that's what is needed. One of the things that we've done is the evaluations used to be once every 10, 11 years. We've now cut the evaluation cycle, and it's now 6 years. So the treadmill has actually, gone faster, right? And then on top of that, the elevation of the treadmill has also gone up, because we keep ratcheting up the standards. So this calls for a response by countries to basically make sure that they are up to speed, that they have the legislation in place, and more importantly, that they actually implement and show results.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Paula, you are overseeing a continent that has not only emerging new problems as the one you were mentioning on crypto assets, but traditional problems on corruption. What kind of measures have you implemented that are different from the global, that went beyond and try to engage the community, in African community in this conversation against corruption? As I mentioned at the beginning, just right now in South Africa and in many other countries, there's unrest about, and regular citizens are wondering, what's going on. We're here talking about all these objectives and commitments. How can we engage regular society and civil society in this fight?
Thank you very much, Giannina. But before I respond, I would like to say that there is corruption in Africa, but there is not traditionally corruption in Africa.
Not traditional corruption.
Okay.
And new corruption.
Okay.
not traditional.
Okay, thank you
no,
very
no,
much.
I didn't.
Because it's everywhere. It is a global problem.
Yes, no, I meant traditional corruption,
Okay.
not cryptocurrency corruption.
Okay. Okay, good. Indeed, I believe that we need in Africa, and as I said, this is a global problem and it requires a global response. Civil society and youth are key in the equation of trying to find solutions and fighting this disease. We were talking about earlier on about the percentage. I think it was asked for young under 32 that were in the room to stand up, and also women. For Africa, I can say that we women are 52%. In terms of youth, more than 60% of Africans are under 30. This is an opportunity. This, for me, personally, it's a big opportunity. It must be accompanied by, as I indicated, that I do believe that we need to inculcate in a very earlier stage values of integrity, of transparency, accountability. And this is done through education at the earliest stage at school. Ethical values, integrity, what does it mean? We need to educate, to sensitize this opportunity in terms of youth or civil society, youth, women, to indicate that we would not accept from our public officials this type of behavior. The resources that institutions, financial institutions like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and many others, if they decide to invest in Africa, because they want to have the reassurance, the assurance that those resources would be used for their intended purposes. And this must be a matter of the entire population, all the citizenship. But at the African Development Bank, as I indicated also, our mission, I would not say mandate, our mission is really to reduce poverty and to promote development, economic and social development. To do so, it is key, and we do have it in our 10-year strategy, in all our governance policy. We do have also a close collaboration and work with what we call transition states, those states that are in a fragility situation. We have a specific fund in order to improve the governance and the institutions of those countries, with including the rule of law, as we were mentioning, that are essential in the fight of corruption. So I think these are the points that I can share, Janina. Thank you.
Thank you. So Raja was just talking about facilitators, and that's a fascinating topic because you were mentioning, Muhammadu, that the World Bank has been sanctioning around 800 companies, I suppose, and then you have 1,000 claims on corruption. I keep wondering, because it's very easy in only 20 minutes to set up a new network of companies in different jurisdictions from here in any other place in the world using the internet. How do you make sure, given all the facilities and how easy it is, that those banned companies or actors are not coming back to get money that is supposed to go to development?
Yeah, no, just to restate the figures you were referring to, the 1,000 I mentioned was the number of entities that had been subject to cross-debarment, sanctioned by one MDB, whether the World Bank, the African Development Bank, or any of the other ones that are in the agreement, and then cross-debarred by the others, altogether cumulatively 1,000. That's what I was referring to. And the 800 was cumulatively the number of companies that we have sanctioned since we have our new sanction system, 2007. So that is obviously something we are very concerned about and that we monitor. We refer to it as sanction evasion. You don't want people to be sanctioned and to find a way to come back either under a different name or through some type of shenanigans. So we actually do have mechanisms where we are, number one, monitoring all the companies that are sanctioned by the World Bank Group. We have an office within the World Bank, which is called actually within INT, the Integrity Compliance Office. When we sanction a company, before they can come back and do business with the bank, they must meet a number of integrity compliance standards, and that's being monitored by that particular office. But that's not really what you're referring to, because that supposes that the company is working towards meeting its integrity compliance standards. What you're referring to is more a company changing its names or having a different owner.
Exactly.
It is something that is difficult to control, that is for sure. But we do want to make sure that whenever we're dealing with an entity, from that standpoint, we do check to make sure that we know about that particular entity. We know if they were an affiliate, for example, or a successor to a company that we have sanctioned. We do impose disclosure requirement to different companies to tell us if there is a change in their particular corporate structure, and that allows us also to monitor any changes that happen from that standpoint. But I think it is something we always have to be mindful of, and it's something we monitor constantly when we deal with new companies, to just make sure that there are no such changes such that a company would be coming back to be doing business with the World Bank under a different name. And it is easier to do in some jurisdictions, but it's something that constantly we are paying attention to. But it is a risk that we monitor at the World Bank Group.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, if I can come in. You know, I think this is where the beneficial ownership register comes in. And
Yes.
FEDEF has now mandated that countries need to put in place a beneficial ownership register or an equivalent. And this is where the information would need to be accurate. It has to be updated, right? And so, the procurement, for procurement purposes, actually you ought to be able to refer to that register or equivalent. And I think that's where, again, you need to get the parties that are bidding for contracts, for example, to declare exactly who the beneficial owners are, and then this would then be verified.
Absolutely, but just having one jurisdiction not doing so affects the rest of the global economy, as you said before. So, and that's why I want to ask you, Björk, because I know Norway has been actively supporting different initiatives, global initiatives on how to improve this implementation of measures against corruption. Can you give us a success example? Is there, what works? Do we have like a role model to follow, or at least something similar to get inspired, and give us some examples of good news.
Sure. We hear certainly there are challenges and problems, but there are good news as well. One of the pieces of good news is that there are a lot of countries that request technical assistance to help address corruption in their countries. And one of the agencies that provides that is UNODC. And UNODC has received more requests for technical assistance than the organization had capacity to actually to respond to. So we've just signed a new agreement where we have increased our support to UNODC to be able to provide countries with that assistance so that countries can, get further in addressing corruption. Just to mention another couple of examples, there is a network called the Corruption Hunters Network that is supported by NORAD, which involves prosecutors, lawyers, judges that can get together and exchange perspectives. I think that is important to move forward. And finally, we also heard about the need to collaborate with academia to have the research and the knowledge base to be able to know, what works and what doesn't work. And Norway, together with a number of other partners, supports a center called the U4 Center. It's based in Bergen, the Christian Michelin Institute in Norway. If you don't know it, look it up. They post papers and research around anything to do with corruption as well as response to corruption.
Thank you very much. Claudia, you were describing a critical and actually an extreme situation that you lived in your native Guatemala. And as a Central American myself, and thinking about not only judges, but also journalists who are in exile. More than 150 Nicaraguan journalists are in Costa Rica, Mexico, and other places in exile, and judges as well. So not only in this particular region, but in general, when you think about independent judges and a healthy judiciary, what can you do if the leaders of the country take control, as you described? What's the international response that you would be expecting in a situation so critical like that?
I think that we need to put a focus on who they are. We need to name and shame them. And I think it's very useful, that the United States and other democratic countries have lists of people that are undermining democracy and corruption. And we are seeing that the State Department is naming people in higher positions that are undermining democracy, and they are attacking judges and prosecutors. And for example, the actual Attorney General in Guatemala is in one of those lists, named by the State Department for obstructing justice, but also higher judges in the Supreme Court, in the Constitutional Court. So the institutions are destroyed, but people know that who are the ones who are responsible. But I think that we need to elevate that level and go to not only the name and shame actions, but also try to understand where are their assets, what are they doing, take them away from the financial system like the Global Magnitsky List does. Just last week, or the week before, the United States also announced that they put in the Magnitsky List 3 companies from Guatemala that are from Russian origins and that are being using corruption to exploit the natural resources that we have. The way that they do that is because they have the backup of the government, because they've been operating in the country for 20 years. So I think that the international actions against, the people that are responsible for undermining the rule of law in the country is important. Because, as I was saying before, the level of judicial corruption, then there is nothing in the country that can detain or can stop kleptocrats in our countries. And when you destroy the trust and the credibility in the institutions, then comes violence. And we are talking about one of the regions that are most violent in the region. We saw the 2 US government officials Jack Sullivan and Samantha Powell to mention Central America as a place that is really putting at risk the security of the region and is undermining the development of all the people. We're talking about a country that doesn't allow 2 million teenagers to go to school, you know, because corruption is taking away the opportunity for education. In my country, half of the population doesn't have food to eat, lives under poverty or low poverty conditions. So this is what corruption does. And I think that corruption also needs to be understood as a human right violation and should be able to persecute under any jurisdiction.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, all of you, for your remarks and for your answers. I don't know if we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Please go to the mics in the center, in the allies, so that everybody, can you go to the mic, please, next to you? Yes.
So my name is Maria Cristina. I am a political exile in the United States. I have a lot of gratitude because I witnessed against corruption in Brazil and they tried to kill me, so I came here and they gave me asylum. And basically I'm fighting again against corruption, and it's so crazy in Brazil that the political party got in my inheritance asking for money. That's how it is in Brazil. And it's the same people that is destroying the Amazon, it's the same people that is fighting the democracy, the results of the elections. So I believe there must be something that is universal, that protects democracy and protects whistleblowers all over the world, because we cannot be in threats like this, and the United States cannot be defending all the whistleblowers all over the world. So since you are here, I would like to know if there is a possibility to create a kind of a board or something that all the countries can unite and protect basics, pillars for the planet, like corruption and climate change and more women in politics. There are some bases that need to be defended. So I want to know if there is a possibility for something like this.
Maria Cristina, do you want to address your question to a particular member of the panel?
Whoever want to answer.
Who wants to respond? Go ahead.
Well, I think it's important what you're saying, and I think that there are different efforts that are being promoted to protect the ones that want to defend democracy, want to defend the rule of law, want to fight for corruption. And for example, there is an integrity sanctuary that is being created for whistleblowers, and that is going to be announced also this week in one of the panels. And there's also a fellowship for people that are fighting corruption in Central America, journalists, human rights defenders, former officials, that will also be implemented soon.
Thank you. Yes, next question.
I'm Ana Gomes from Transparency International Portugal, and I would like to address the point made by Mr. Kumar, I couldn't agree more, that indeed fighting money laundering is fighting corruption. But if you look at the European level, for instance, the incredible amount of money that is going into all sorts of criminal activities, criminal networks, through the so-called carousel fraud in VAT. It has been identified by the European Commission since 2011 that about 1/3 of the European budget, over 50 billion per year, actually goes to finance all sorts of organizations like that through the money deviated from VAT. And yet the finance ministers didn't change, as the Commission proposed, the regulation so that this would be avoided. This highlights how the finance ministers are sometimes often the ones least sensitive to indeed the security angle, not to mention, of course, recovery of the money for the state budget. And so my question to you is actually, The ECB itself, the European Central Bank, doesn't have a mandate to fight money laundering. It always says that it's up to the national competent authorities. They can consider it in terms of their prudential supervision, but they don't have a mandate to fight money laundering. So, of course, this makes it more difficult to be enacted. I would like to have your comment on that. And then on the question of the corruption in the judiciary, don't you think, I see this in my own country, but, and in European countries in general, don't you think that the advocacy for all the enacting of all these private courts, intransparent, opaque private courts, namely the arbitrary courts and the ISDS mechanisms, that is actually also one element very much fostering corruption in the judiciary?
Thank you. Do you want to answer the last one, and then who? Do you want to answer the first one? Yes.
Yeah. So on the first part of your question, I think when FEDEF basically does that country assessment, we take a look at the risks and the context of each country, and each country has to do their national risk assessment. And one of the things that we also look at is the extent to which authorities are actually coordinating their actions. So this comes back to what is the quality of response and what you're actually doing about the challenges that your country faces. So this forms actually part and parcel of the evaluation framework. Yeah. So again, I think that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of taking a look at whether the country's on top of the issues and problems and challenges, and whether they've got effective solutions that are in place or not.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you want to add something, Mohammed? No? Okay. Yeah, let's move on to the last question. Last question, because we don't have more time. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Faisal Anwar. I'm from Pakistan. I am a former banker and now I'm an independent consultant. I just have one question about the recovery of stolen assets, since we have been talking about a lot, and in that context we've also discussed the the role of STAR initiative, which was taken by the World Bank in collaboration with UNODC, etc. So let's say that in the unlikely event that the criminal proceeds of kleptocrats, for example, are discovered and they are recovered as well. So how do you repatriate them back to the countries from where such wealth is stolen? Because you see, my concern is that maybe in a country like Pakistan, where one corrupt government after another corrupt government keeps on coming to power, I mean, you are basically repatriating those proceeds again to those countries, and these proceeds are placed in the hands of the same corrupt people. Their names change, but they're the same. My second question is to Mr. Rajkumar of FATF. I think we have been waxing eloquent since morning about the sanctions, the US sanctions, UN sanctions, and the FATF ratings, particularly the ones that can place the countries in grey lists and blacklists. But my question to the FATF chair is that do you get any reports from these countries? For example, when Pakistan was under, was a part of the grey list for the last, I think, 3 to 4 years, did you get any reports that how many businesses had closed down in Pakistan, how many small and medium businesses had to be wiped out? I mean, you keep saying that we are targeting the countries. When you say you're targeting the countries as the watchdog, what do you exactly mean by that? You should be targeting the corrupt people, the kleptocrats, not the common masses, the common people. I mean, in my living memory, and I've got a banking...
I'm so sorry, but I need to interrupt you. And you already asked 2 amazing questions.
Yeah. So these are sort of
and I don't think we have time.
And I'd appreciate if I can get some comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your questions, Raja, and Mohammed. Do you want to...
The second
The second
Okay.
one.
So the repatriation of stolen assets, it's a complex issue, and I think part of the issue is exactly what you're referring to. How do you make sure the money that's stolen and that's being repatriated doesn't go back into the wrong hands? And this is very much considered in these repatriation decisions. And generally, there is a lot of consultation that's taking place. Number one, the repatriation is not automatic. When you think about stolen assets, in some cases they are frozen, in other cases they are confiscated, and yet in other cases they get repatriated. But when they get repatriated, generally there are a lot of safeguards that are being put in place. Think, for example, of one of the famous cases, which was the repatriation of the Abacha, Sani Abacha, the former president of Nigeria, the stolen assets, and how long it took to actually discuss the whole issue of repatriating some of those funds. And this is precisely some of the issues that people try to get to the bottom of. What are the safeguards to make sure that the money is not just sent back to the country, but there are adequate safeguards to make sure it gets to the right place, and in some cases to involve even civil society in monitoring and making sure that the money is not, again, being stolen, is not being misused. So that is certainly a consideration, and this is one of the reasons why it takes a lot of times not just to identify the assets, but also the whole repatriation process takes a while.
I think on the second question, I'd be very happy to have a conversation on the sidelines with the gentleman from Pakistan. I know that this is really talking about corruption, so what he's asking is relating to grey listing. We can take this offline with him. Yeah, happy to have a conversation with him.
Thank you.
Well, we're late. Apologies for all the ones who had more questions, but we're running late. I want to thank all the members of this first plenary for your marks, for your time, and for helping us understand. Thank you so much. We're coming back in.
Yes. Thank you to our moderator and to our esteemed speakers, and of course to you, the audience, for your really thoughtful questions. That's it for today's plenaries, but there's still a number of workshops taking place, including Whistleblowers Without Borders and the Fight Beyond the Battlefield, supporting Ukraine's anti-corruption efforts. Please visit the IACCseries.org website for the full program. Thank you for your presence and your participation. I'll see you back here tomorrow. Thank you.